Welcome. I am NortdeoIsReading, and I'm going to be reading to you The Revenge of the Shadow King by Derek Benz and J.S. Lewis. This was one of my favorite books in middle school, and it's relatively introductory, and I feel like it would be a good introduction to this channel. So, without further ado, the prologue. Max Sumner peeked over his blanket, paralyzed by fear. Something was in his bedroom. Something in the darkness. Something bad. His eyes peered into the web of night that draped his room in mysterious shadows. From beneath the familiar shape of his desk, which was strewn with comic books and trading cards, something was watching him. Max couldn't see it, but he could hear it breathing. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, and for a brief moment, Max saw something dark and sinister creeping toward him. Its skin was like coal, and instead of eyes, only cold, empty sockets peered back. Step by step, it inched closer. Max opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came. He tried to jump, but his legs wouldn't move. Another lightning burst, and the monster was next to Max, reaching its hungry fingers toward him. Before Max could cry out, he was ripped from his sheets and thrown against his bedroom wall with a crash. He cried out as he felt the nails rip, the board shatter, and the electrical cables snap. Like a rocket, he flew into the stormy night, 3 stories above the rain-slicked cobblestones far below. He never had a chance. Chapter 1. It's all in the cards. Avalon, Minnesota was a perfectly boring town. That is, it was both perfect and boring all at the same time. Every yard was beautifully manicured, and each garden was overgrown with flowers worthy of a blue ribbon at the county fair. It was also quite small. There was a single street light, 1 bank, a grocery store, and 1 screen movie house that was closed on Sundays. Parents let their children play outside after dark, and nobody ever locked a front door. In fact, Avalon was a town where every perfect day was just like the day before, and would be, in turn, just like the next. While this might seem refreshing to somebody from a bustling city filled with noisy cars, towering skyscrapers, traffic jams, police sirens, to Grayson Maximillian Sumner III, or Max as he preferred, Avalon's serenity was a perfect nightmare. Like Avalon itself, there was little remarkable about Max, at least on the outside. He was tan from a summer spent back and forth from beach to the baseball diamond, and his thick brown hair, not short, but not long, had been bleached by the sun, giving it the appearance of corn silk. None of those qualities made him look out of the ordinary. Yet if Max did have one special feature, it was his eyes. They were large and tended to change color with the weather, though most often they were a deep gray. Much to his embarrassment, little old ladies liked to point out just how beautiful those eyes were, and typically at the most inopportune times, like at the mall in front of his friends, who would tease him mercilessly later. But in a crowded schoolyard, Max just didn't stand out. At 11 years of age, he was neither short nor tall, thick nor thin. He wasn't the fastest runner, couldn't hit the ball the farthest, and he was lost, and has lost, many arm wrestling matches just as he has won. But when teams were picked, he was never last either. It was true. Max didn't stick out, except for his money. The Sumner family was rich. Not the kind of rich that many lived in a big fancy house, though he did, or that his father drove an Italian sports car. He had at least 3. The Sumners were the kind of rich that meant they owned entire towns, mega malls, high-rise towers, and vast acreages of farmland all around the world. Real estate investments had made the Sumners billionaires. Rumor had it, many times over. Avalon, for the most part, was one such Sumner property. But Max never cared too much about any of it. All that concerned him for the moment was that he was late. He glanced at his watch and frowned. Terribly late. Max zipped through Avalon's side streets on his broken bike en route to the Shop of Antiquities, the only place in the town he found interesting, and the only place, it seemed, that hadn't changed since his parents' divorce. The Sumner mansion seemed empty without his dad, even though Max's mom and baby sister were still there. But Annika Sumner hardly paid attention to her kids. There were simply too many activities for Avalon's leading socialite to be burdened with raising children, especially now that she was single. Besides, that's what Rosa, the children's nanny, was hired for. Max had never felt so alone in all his life, and the summer vacation drawing to a close, he was getting even more depressed and thoughts of homework, and worse, having to talk about his parents' messy breakup to everyone at school. News of the divorce had made the local paper, of course. That's just how it was in a small town like Avalon, Minnesota. Privacy didn't exist, especially when your name was Sumner. The headlines talked about the enormous sum of money Max's mom received as a settlement, but money didn't read you bedtime stories or go on family picnics. It wasn't as good at consoling you after a loss in Little League or at helping you with math homework. No. Max was starting to resent his family's money. His parents chased it like dogs after a mail truck, but he'd have traded every penny to have his parents back together. Max wasn't holding his breath, though. Angry, he pedaled harder. As the pavement raced beneath Max's tires in a blur, the vague memory of a horrible dream lingered, tugging at the corner of his mind, but whenever he tried to recall the details, it seemed to slip away. Arriving at his destination, Max jumped off his bike and leaned it up against the wall as he walked under a faded sign that read, Shop of Antiquities. It was a store that dealt in rare books, ancient mysteries, the occasional tourist trinket, and a vast array of collectibles, some authentic, some not. Breezing through the creaky doorway, Max was immediately greeted by the aroma of musty books and sweet pipe tobacco as he stepped into the shadowy front room. A handful of stained glass lamps offered meager light as Max's eyes slowly adjusted to the place he had come to know so well. All about lay a curious muddle of treasures. Ancient yellowed books were stuffed in every possible crevice, and curling maps were tacked to the walls. Max wove through the clutter, ignoring the "Beware of Dragons" sign that hung askew on the back wall. Disappearing through a low archway, he rushed up a flight of steps and grabbed hold to the knocker that hung on a heavy oaken door. As Max knocked, the sound echoed all about, filling his mind with visions of castles and knights. "Well, what's the password?" a nervous voice asked from the other side. "Excalibur," Max replied. A series of locks clicked, slid, and unsnapped, before the door slid slowly opened. "Hey, Ernie," Max offered, slipping in. "Am I late?" "Just me and Natalia so far," Ernie Tweeny explained, wearing ridiculously oversized black-rimmed glasses that perched crookedly on his face. He was chomping loudly on a chocolate bar that was sticking like brown goop to his once shiny braces. It was a wonder he wasn't as wide as he was tall, given his zealous consumption of sweets. Ernie was thin and dangerously uncoordinated, with a jumble of black hair that needed constant combing. His wardrobe choices were best described as eclectic, regularly consisting of argyle socks, plaid pants that were bit too short, and a striped sweater a few sizes too big. Ernie was a self-admitted coward, spooked by everything from spiders to his own shadow. But despite it all, he wasn't ashamed of who he was. To his credit, Ernie was incurably enthusiastic about everything, and a loyal friend. But though his quirky antics were good for a laugh, they were bad news for his asthma. And for all of that, and more, Ernie was one of Max's best friends. Behind Ernie perched Natalia Felicia Anastasia Romanov in perfect posture. She sat at a hulking round table that filled the little room with the large picture window overlooking Main Street. "Hello, Grayson," she greeted him, using Max's formal name. Natalia loved formalities. If one wasn't required, she'd invent an occasion. She also loved detective work, particularly solving mysteries, spending a great deal of her time studying things like voice recognition and footprint patterns. She knew it had been Max coming up the stairs long before he knocked, and it was for that reason she didn't bother looking up from the stack of strange cards that lay neatly before her when he entered the room. Natalia's snow-white face was painted with a light dusting of freckles, and her red hair, long and wiry, was pulled into two fierce-looking braids. Spunky was a word adults often used when describing her, but precautious might have fit her more aptly. Natalia was fearless, with a razor-sharp wit and startlingly large vocabulary for an 11-year-old. She was best known for her ferocious reading habits and obsessive love of unicorns, and having the finest detective mind in the whole school. Admittedly, though, there was very little competition. Two ugly, mismatched chairs remained empty after Max and Ernie took their seats next to Natalia. One chair was a good deal larger than the other, which might have seemed odd, but for that matter, the entire room was rather odd. Strange symbols were painted across the peeling plaster of the brick wall, which also held numerous pictures and charts of mysterious places, creatures, and other things. In the corners were iron sconces, and the smoke from the candles crept across the dark ceiling like the nest of dizzy snakes. Some people might have called it cozy, others might have called it cramped. But to Max, it somehow felt like home. At least, more than his house did lately. "So are you ready to play?" Ernie asked anxiously, thumbing through his own stack of cards, which were very much like Natalia's deck, apart from being in a far worse condition and in no particular order whatsoever. "I guess," Max answered, looking around. He was still trying to catch his breath, relieved he wasn't the last person to arrive. He hated being late for anything. That was one of the first lessons in business his father taught him. You don't want to be too early for an appointment, but never under any circumstances were you to be late. Max had never had a business appointment, of course, and though he could imagine what one might be like, he was in no hurry to grow up. If only his father felt the same way. However, the three friends weren't worried about business just then. Their thoughts were focused on the cards held in their hands. They belonged to a game called Round Table, an ancient game that was rumored to have been invented by King Arthur and taught to only the most trusted and valiant boys and girls in the land. At least that's what it said on the box. Larger than a deck of traditional playing cards, in both scale and number, the cards were painted with all sorts of fascinating traps and spells, as well as knights and monsters. The objective was to defeat your opponent's armies through strategy, strength of arms, and luck of a pair of 10-sided dice called knucklebones. All three friends had their very own deck, which they had spent incalculable time collecting, building, and worrying over. Yet to them, the juiciest part of Round Table was the fact that as far as they knew, nobody else in the entire world, or at least in Avalon, Minnesota, played. It was their secret, and they liked it that way. As Max slipped off his backpack and reached for his deck of cards, Olaf Iverson, whom everybody knew as Ivor, strode into the room in his immense black boots. The owner and proprietor of the Shop of Antiquities, Ivor was rather tall, with sloping broad shoulders and a waistline not dissimilar to Santa Claus's. He was very distinguished, as one could tell by his silverly waxed mustache and closely groomed beard. He was also very intelligent, speaking no less than 27 languages by his own account. Where he came from and what he had done before he had opened the Shop of Antiquities was always up for heated debate, but the kids loved him like an adopted grandfather, and he was the only adult who seemed to really understand them. Not to mention, his was the only store in the world where Round Table was sold. "Good morning, Ivor," Ernie said, beaming. "A good morning indeed. Well, I'll take your word for it, Master Tweenie," Ivor responded in his deep rumbling voice. "But be careful. I did not ask for a good morning, and here you're wishing it to me all the same, whether I want it or not." While Ernie was trying to puzzle out Ivor's reply, Natalia laughed. She was the kind of girl who liked to pretend she knew things others didn't. "And you, Natalia? What have you got there?" asked Ivor. "My new costume. Do you like it?" Natalia rose from her seat, showing off her elf outfit her mother had made her, complete with green moccasins and a matching emerald dress and cape. Why she wore costumes to the games was anyone's guess. She said it helped her get into character. Whatever that meant. "You look like a tree frog," Ernie joked, feeling unusually brave. Normally, Natalia would have pinched him for the insult, but today she either didn't care or hadn't heard him. Instead, she spun around in obvious pride. "Very pretty," Ivor said, with a brief clap. "But I'm afraid we have quite a quest ahead of us today, and we really must begin. No time for dawdling. Are the Gray Griffins ready?" "But we're still missing a member of our team," Ernie, the smallest member of the Gray Griffins, pointed out. "I thought the rule was that we never leave anyone behind." Just then, panting heavily and caked with mud, Harley Davidson Eisenstein burst through the door. He was big, looking at least 13 years old, even though he was only 11, with a rough reputation to match. Intense eyes, the color of a blue storm, were hidden by shaggy chestnut hair, and the grease smudges on his sturdy jaw showed he had been working on his go-kart again. Harley tended to wear t-shirts with pictures of muscle cars and rock bands, and his old jeans were slightly tattered and fringed around the cuffs, covering his faded canvas sneakers. Girls thought he was gross because, among other things, his fingernails were always dirty and his knuckles were covered in warts. But Harley didn't much care for whatever other people thought. "Ah, young Master Eisenstein, it appears you have joined us at last. Please, pull up a chair, but be quick about it, mind you," Ivor said sternly. "Sorry, Ivor," Harley mumbled as he slumped into the last empty seat. Despite the commotion, Ivor began to explain the tournament rules, set the time limit, and inspect everyone's knuckle bones to ensure they met his strict approval. Pulling out his own deck of cards, Harley turned to Max. "You won't believe what just happened." "Whoa, where'd you get that card? It's awesome!" Ernie exclaimed, cutting off Harley mid-sentence. "Ah, yes," Ivor said, as he reached over and drew the card in question from Harley's stack. The old man studied the image intently, frowning at the wrinkles around his eyes formed great crevices. "Oberon." The groom seemed to grow cold as the young friends quieted. Yes, Ivor continued. This is a rare card, but I don't recall giving it to you. Do you remember from whence it came? Harley shrugged. Well, in any event, I suggest you put it away and forget you have it. Why? Asked Ernie. Why indeed, Master Tweenie. Do you not know who Oberon is? Ernie looked at him with a blank expression, his jaw hanging as a bit of chocolate drool slid off his chin. Pop quizzes were not his thing. Oberon is the Shadow King, a rather menacing name that doesn't even begin to describe his more charming traits. Wise and terrible, deadly and ruthless, he's the cruel and unimaginable, powerful ruler of the Shadowlands of Fairy. Master Eisenstein, you hold a card that will give you a great advantage in this game, but at what cost? The card almost assures victory, but it has been known to betray the holder at the most inconvenient times. That's silly. And Talia waved her hand as if she were waving away a fly. This is just a game. Ooh, a card can't betray anyone. Young lady, Ivor said, frowning. You will have to learn that not everything is as simple as your Saturday morning cartoons. Taking this card for granted, or anything for that matter, could be your undoing, and the undoing of your friends. I certainly will not have you putting your friends in danger simply because you fail to recognize this simple lesson. Talia squirmed a bit under his stern gaze, but Max and Ernie scrambled from their chairs to huddle around Harley, each trying to get a closer look at Oberon's trading card. Wrapped in a cloak of darkness, the Shadow King's eyes glowed with malice beneath a deep hood as grasping fingers reached toward the four friends hungrily. It was a disturbing picture, and Max quickly wished he hadn't looked at it. He's freaky, Ernie said, chomping loudly on a second chocolate bar, though this one had peanuts. Quite so, Ivor frowned. But until we solve the puzzle of how this card found its way into your deck, why don't you put it away for now? Eh, Arlie? In the meantime, the rest of you need to take your seats. We have a game to play, so let no clouds of darkness stand in our way. Before we begin, though, I must set the scene. Ivor was a masterful storyteller, and his involvement as their game master added a depth to the game that made it almost seem real. A twist for this won't be a free-for-all today. No, today is different. Today you must fight together. An ancient evil has awakened, and darkness has spread across the land. Ivor looked to each of their eyes. You four are all that stands between this army of darkness and the complete destruction of the world you love. Your armies, your magic, and your intelligence are your only tools. No one will ever be here to save you, and I must tell you, if you fight, you have very little chance of surviving. But if you don't take a stand, life as you know it will be changed forever. The kids sat enraptured by Ivor's tale. They'd never played as a team before, but that only made it all more exciting. You have precisely 10 seconds until they attack, Ivor stated, pulling out his own stack of round table cards and laying them on the table. The cards were face down, but they all suspected what lay on the other side. Goblins. Horrible, nasty, and smelly goblins. An army of them. What are we gonna do? Ernie stuttered in fear. We fight, Max replied, pulling out his knuckle bones. Excellent, Ivor said, with a smile. Then it begins. Round Table was played on an elaborate board that resembled an ancient yellowed map that could hold up to four players, but could be expanded to accommodate 6 when 2 boards were attached. That was the case this day, for Ivor was building his army of cards on the far end of the table, directly across from Natalia. The three boys flanked them, palms sweating as they awaited Ivor's first move. The odds seemingly stacked against him. Ivor went first. The question was whether he would build his defenses or go straight for the attack. The Grey Griffins didn't have long to wait. Ivor quickly flipped over several cards lined up before him, revealing a gruesome army. A horde of goblins, stony gargoyles, a snarling werewolf, and a creepy monster called a Slayer Goblin. Max practically fell off his chair. The Slayer Goblin. It looked exactly like the monster from his nightmare. But how? Ivor himself seemed a little surprised at the cards he had drawn, and for a long, silent moment his brow furrowed a deep thought. Was it worry? Max couldn't tell. But whatever it was, it quickly passed, and Ivor's attack was swift and vicious. I challenge thee, Master Tweenie, Ivor called out as he rolled his knuckle bones, a beautiful pair of dice that seemed to be made of pure silver. Ernie countered with a roll of his own, but Ivor's cast was higher, and before Ernie could even voice his disappointment, the old man removed Ernie's card from the battlefield. Then he turned to Max. The Slayer Goblin attacks, Ivor challenged. Max gulped as Ivor shook his hand before casting the metallic knuckle bones. An 85. A good roll. On top of that, each card, and in this case, each monster, had an attack value, making it stronger or weaker than the other card. A garden fairy might have a small attack value. A troll had a big one. The Slayer's attack value was even higher. When Max saw Ivor's roll and combined it with a massive attack value, he bit his lip in frustration. The Slayer would not be easy to defeat. Max shut his eyes, remembering the horrible sound of the Slayer's claws scratching across the wood floor of his bedroom. Weakly, he let his own knuckle bones fall from his hand. The first bone fell. A 9. That meant whatever his roll, it was the 90s. He had a chance, but his heart skipped a beat as the second bone rolled off the table, skittering across the floor before resting next to Harley's foot. Well, asked Ernie, the suspense more than he could handle. Max needed a roll of 94 to combine with his knight's fairly high defensive value to win. That meant... It's a 3, Harley shouted as Natalia and Ernie cheered. A tie. He didn't win, but Max had survived, repelling the Slayer's attack. But the battle was far from over. The game went back and forth, to and fro, as both sides took heavy casualties. Yet even though the Griffins outnumbered Ivor's army 4-1, and they should have defeated their old friend with little trouble, his cards were simply too valuable, and as daylight gave way to dusk, there was no definitive winner, and so Ivor decided to suspend the game until next Saturday. You have all fought valiantly, he said, with an approving smile. But you practically wiped me out, Ernie sighed, looking somberly at his depleted deck. What do I have to play with next week? I almost lost every card I own. Me too. Harley shook his head in disappointment. Indeed, Ivor noted. But winning was not today's goal. Only survival mattered. He then returned a stacked deck to each of the Griffins, much to their surprise. Usually, when a card was lost in battle, it was gone forever. Or at least until it could be won back. Ivor's gesture was generous to say the least. What I'm concerned with is that you have each learned something today. Learned? Natalia asked with a frown, but greedily accepting her old cards back all the same. What do you mean? I mean exactly what I said, of course. You can think about it and tell me later if you like, but now I must insist that you rush home to the dinners that are no doubt waiting for you. The 4 kids were best friends. It had been that way since kindergarten. when they had found themselves united to protect Ernie from the school bully. Now, just a few years later, they were inseparable, with their very own secret society called the Order of the Grey Griffins. It had been Max's idea, and his father had encouraged it, even building them a vast clubhouse in the woods where they could meet. There were secret passwords, which Ernie never remembered, secret handshakes, which seemed to change on a daily basis, and even secret songs, which no one sang except Natalia. "Where were you today?" Ernie asked Harley, as they stepped through the door and into the fresh air. "Me and my mom had to rush to Roscoe to the vet," Harley said gravely. Roscoe was an enormous hunting dog that Harley had received for his 6th birthday. The dog was as big as a tank, ferocious as a lion, and developed an unfortunate taste for postal workers and truck tires. But Harley loved him. "What happened?" Natalia gasped, finally noticing several small cuts on Harley's forehead. "There's blood underneath your fingernails. What's going on?" "Roscoe got in a fight with something out back behind our place," Harley explained. "I was outside working on my go-kart and Roscoe was chasing squirrels when all of a sudden that stupid dog started growling and barking. The next thing I knew, he was running out towards the trees." "What was it?" asked Max. "I'm not sure. By the time I got there, Roscoe was fighting with it in the bushes, but whatever it was strong and mean. It had Roscoe pinned to the ground." "Roscoe?" Ernie gasped, thinking anything less than an elephant wouldn't stand a chance against Harley's giant canine. "Yeah," answered Harley. "If I hadn't got there, I don't know what would have happened to him." "What did it look like?" Natalia asked as they walked down the street. Though not before stopping to pull out her book of clues, a pink spiraled tablet liberally decorated with unicorn stickers. She always took notes when trying to solve a mystery. "It happened so fast, I didn't get a very good look, but I know it was black. That's all I could see." Then Harley frowned. "Except..." "Well," Natalia prompted, a pen in hand. "I didn't see any eyes," Harley explained. "What do you mean?" "Well, you know when a raccoon or a deer reflects light in their eyes and you can see them from a mile away? Whatever I saw, its eyes didn't reflect anything when I put a flashlight on it." "Hey, that sounds like that card in Ivor's deck today," Ernie said, biting into a chocolate bar. "Yeah," Natalia agreed. "The Slayer Goblin." "I actually have one of those cards," Harley recalled, putting it out of his front pocket. "Here it is. Ivor gave it to me before we took off." "Slayers are the worst kind of goblins," Natalia read from the card as Max and Ernie moved in for a better look. "It says here that they're blind." "Where are its eyes?" asked Ernie, studying the picture intently. "They don't have any," she said as she studied the description at the bottom of the card. "That's the thing. But they are a powerful sense of smell, which is almost as good as being able to see. Maybe even better." She paused dramatically as she looked into each of their eyes. "Go on," Max said impatiently, still a little shaken from the stream about the Slayer. "It also says they can move between the fairy world and our world. I guess they're the only kind of fairy that can do that." What do you mean?" Ernie asked. "I thought we were talking about goblins, not fairies." "A goblin is a fairy," Natalia sighed as she picked up her bike and walked back to the sidewalk. "Don't you know anything? Just like a wolf is a type of dog." At any rate, according to legend, fairies live in a world of shadow that is connected to the earth by magical bridges called portals. These slayers are one of the few creatures that can use the portals. Harley paused a moment as he looked at the picture on the card. "That thing does kind of look like what I saw today," he concluded, after giving it some thought. "Like I said, I didn't get a very good look. Not to mention that fairies aren't real," added Max, more for his own comfort than anything else. "Hey, What if it was a baboon that attacked Roscoe? Ernie suggested, on a wild tangent. I bet there's a whole tribe of baboons living in the woods. Wouldn't that be cool? Everyone looked at Ernie as if he had worms crawling out of his ears. Ernest, cried Natalia in exasperation. Baboons come from Africa, not Avalon, Minnesota. Maybe they migrated, continued Ernie. The idea of baboons loose in his hometown being too interesting to let go. The only thing that migrated is your common sense, Natalia replied. How do you know so much about baboons anyway? Complained Ernie. Because I read books, you nincompoop, she replied. In fact, my dad just bought me an encyclopedia set. I wouldn't talk about dads in front of you-know-who, whispered Ernie, rather too loudly. Max set his jaw. Ernie was right. He didn't like anyone mentioning his dad. The memory of the divorce was too fresh, and it didn't help that Max had only heard from him a couple times in the 3 months since he had left. I'm sorry, Natalia offered, not realizing she had brought up a sore subject. It isn't your fault, Max sighed, pushing his bike ahead of the others. Maybe we can all hang at your place tonight, Ernie called after him. We could stay up and watch TV all night. Can't, Max called back. I'm sleeping at my grandma's. With that, he hopped on his bike and tore off down the road, leaving his friends far behind. Chapter 2. How Max Found a Magic Book. High atop a hill that overlooked Mystic Bay on Lake Avalon, the Sumner estate sprawled for as far as the eye could see. It was nestled among acres of trees and sea of lush grass, a true architectural marvel. The house looked like a medieval castle with gargoyles, turrets, and a grand fountain in the front drive. In fact, it was actually hundreds of years old, imported from Scotland brick by brick, and reconstructed on the Sumner's vast property. It was the envy of everyone in town, but Max didn't care. He would have traded it to have his family back together. I'm home, Max announced to no one in particular as he burst through the kitchen door, out of breath. Hello, Max. Rosa greeted him with a cherubic smile and a rich Spanish accent. While his mom liked to say that Rosa only helped with the cleaning, the fact that Annika Sumner was simply too busy with manicures, hair appointments, shopping sprees in Paris, and a calendar full of social events to bother with household duties. There are many servants, some for driving, some for cooking, some for pulling weeds out of the driveway, but Rosa, an expensive nanny from Toledo, Spain, was an impeccable resume, served as Annika's chief of staff. In her absence, and in many ways, she was more of a mother to Max than his own mom. Hi, Rosa, Max said, digging into the cookie jar. Where are Mom and Hannah? Your sister is taking a nap, Rosa answered, in her delightful Castilian accent. And your mother is gone to Minneapolis for the day. She needed some new clothes for her trip tonight. Max rolled his eyes as he stuffed a whole cookie into his mouth sideways. A former model, who even after 2 children could have graced the covers of fashion magazines, his mother needed new clothes like a zebra needed more stripes. Most of the shoes in her cavernous closet had never even been worn. What's this? Max asked, walking over to the breakfast table where a giant package sat. 3 feet tall and just as wide, it was wrapped in brown paper, and the return address showed that as if it had come from all the way in Scotland. It was from his father, who had been spending time overseas imagining Sumner Enterprises' European real estate ventures. Max ripped open the package with fervor. I believe it's your birthday gift, Rosa smiled. You see, your papa isn't forgotten about you. Max had been devastated when he hadn't heard from his father on his 11th birthday, which had passed 3 weeks earlier. No card, no phone call, no gift, nothing. Of course, his mother reminded him of it every day, letting Max know what a louse his father really was. And though Max didn't want to believe her, his father's lack of interest had been demoralizing. Yet, here it was, the gift he had been waiting for. It wasn't that he needed more stuff, he just needed to know his father cared. Maybe it had been held up in the mail? Digging through the mess of packaging material, Max searched anxiously for his birthday card. Bingo! He pulled out the envelope, but a smile quickly faded. Scribbled on Sumner Enterprises stationery was a brief note that was obviously written by his father's assistant, Ursula, an emotionless, calculating German woman who wore pinstripe pantsuits and pulled her magenta-dyed hair back into a strict bun. Grayson, your father wishes you a happy birthday. He will call you as soon as he gets a chance, the note read. And not a single word more. Max tore the note in half and threw it back in the box, closed the lid without a thought to what was inside, and promptly threw it out the back door. Grayson Maximillian Sumner, what's wrong with you? Rosa demanded. That's a terrible way to show gratitude for a gift. I'm going to pack, then I want to go to my grandma's house right away, he huffed. Call Logan and tell him to have the car ready. With that, Max stomped away, his eyes downcast in frustration, though he felt guilty for snapping at Rosa. She was so sweet, and he didn't want to start treating the household staff like his mother generally did. But he was mad. That's why he failed to see, until it was too late, a silent figure standing in the shadows of the kitchen archway. Like a ping-pong ball, Max bounced off the man, who felt as if he were made from stone, not flesh and blood like everyone else. Max looked up, peering into the eyes set beneath a disapproving brow. The man's face seemed to be fixed in a constant critical judgment, and a mysterious scar trailed down his chiseled cheekbone. Short-cropped raven hair parted to the right in military efficiency, his face covered in dark stubble. Oh, sorry, Logan. I didn't see you standing there. Max apologized to his driver, relaxing a bit as he rubbed his forehead. What have I told you about walking with your head down? The man scolded in a brisk Scottish accent. It wasn't an ankesking tone typically used by servants. Then again, Logan wasn't a typical servant. That if I keep my head down, I would walk right into a trap, recited Max. If there aren't any traps around here, the only thing I have to worry about in Avalon is dying of boredom. Rosa laughed quietly. Logan didn't. Whether you wanted it or not, Max, you were born into an important family, Logan said sternly, crossing his thick, hairy arms, and there are more ruthless people in the world than you think. You'd make a nice prize for any one of them. It's my job to make sure that doesn't happen. Why anyone would bother, especially when his own father didn't seem to care, was incomprehensible to Max. But he trusted Logan, who had never been wrong. Not even once. Logan also seemed to know things before they happened, which was why the Scotsman wasn't actually on the family's payroll because his driving skills, despite racing professionally in Italy for several years. In fact, Logan was the Sumner family bodyguard, and you'd be hard-pressed to find a more qualified candidate in the civilized world. He was a bit of a mystery and not much of a conversationalist, and Max had gathered from a handful of stories that Logan had been raised in an orphanage somewhere in the damp alleyways of Glasgow, Scotland. There were rumors that he had run away and survived as a street fighter in the underworld of Europe, and that he eventually stowed away on a cargo ship, sailed to China, and studied Kung Fu with a series of anonymous Grand Masters. Max didn't know much more, other than that Logan spoke nearly as many languages as Ivor and somehow was on a first-name basis with the Queen of England. But why he always wore black and no smile ever crossed his lips, Max could only guess. I believe you'll find everything in order, Logan said as he handed a fully loaded backpack to Max. The car is waiting outside. Thanks, Logan, Max said, amazed at how the driver always seemed to be one step ahead of him. Logan dropped off Max at Grandma Caliburn's earlier than anticipated. Not that it mattered. His mother decided to go straight from the mall to the airport to catch her plane to New York. She didn't even bother saying goodbye. Hannah, Max's 18-month-old sister, was going to stay at the house with Rosa. The kids were always left behind. Thanks, Logan, Max said politely as he hopped out of the blacked-out Mercedes sedan. The car was one of Logan's latest projects and was in the midst of a supercharger overhaul. Heads of the state didn't even have cars like that. Then again, heads of state didn't have Logan in their employ. No problem. Just remember to stay alert. I don't want to see all your training go to waste. But Logan's warning fell on deaf ears as Max sprinted towards his grandmother, who was standing on the front steps waving. She was the only thing in Max's world that hadn't turned upside down, and by the time he finished a delicious homemade dinner later that night, he had forgotten all about the divorce and was soon laughing with Grandma Caliburn over a plate of cookies. Just being around this magical woman had a way of curing all of life's troubles. There was no one Max loved more. It's wonderful having you here, Max, she said in a soft voice, tucking him into bed after a night of old movies and card games. Like his mother, Max's grandma was beautiful, tall, and regal with salt and pepper hair cropped in a stylish bob. But where his mother was nervous and demanding, Grandma Caliburn was gentle and kind. Her husband, Max's grandfather, had died 2 years before, and ever since then, Max had spent a great deal of time with her. She was lonely, but as he thought about it, maybe Max was really the lonely one. Do you miss Grandpa? He asked, looking at a picture of his grandparents on the nightstand. Very much. Max sighed. He remembered every detail of that tragic day 2 years ago when the patrol car rolled up the gravel driveway with the news of his grandfather's death. The officer didn't have to say a word. Max's grandma already knew. She dreamed of it the night before. Who's that in the picture with Grandpa? I haven't seen it before, Max wondered, wanting to push away the dark memories. It kind of looks like Ivor. Grandma Caliburn smiled, picking up the picture Max was looking at. Dressed in dapper suits with fancy sashes across their chests, Grandpa Caliburn held a rapier in his hands, and Ivor was gripping his staff. They looked to be in their early 20s. Yes, that is Ivor with your grandfather, she said, smiling. This was taken a long time ago, before the war. London, I think it was. Your grandfather asked me to marry him a few days later. Grandpa and Ivor were friends? Asked Max, astonished at the thought. Yes, I suppose you could say they were. She paused thoughtfully. She seemed about ready to share something very important, but then decided against it and gave him a kiss on his forehead. I'll see you bright and early for chores. Don't let the bed bugs bite, and be sure to say your prayers. Good night, Grandma. Love you. Sweet dreams, honey. Later that night, the serenade of crickets faded as the dark storm rolled across the sky. The stars were lost behind ominous clouds, while the wind began to run its cool autumn fingers through the trees. A crack of thunder shook the house as flashes of lightning electrified the air. Max awoke with a start, unsure of where he was. And though it took several fuzzy moments, eventually his eyes adjusted to the strange strobe effect of lighting bursts that painted the familiar landscape of his mother's childhood bedroom. Unable to settle back down, Max lay awake. He felt like an orphan. Maybe the divorce was his fault, he thought. Maybe if he had been a better son or showed more interest in his father's business, things wouldn't be the way they were. His mother had sent him to counseling right after it happened, the most expensive she could find. Counseling seemed to be the answer to all of life's problems, but it wasn't working. Tired of thinking about it, Max whipped off his covers and went in search of a midnight snack. A few chocolate chip cookies would hit the spot. Half asleep, Max shuffled down the hall toward the kitchen stairs, but stopped suddenly when he saw light seeping out from beneath the door to his grandfather's study. He hadn't been in that room since that fateful night of the car wreck, but curiosity got the better of Max. Slowly, he turned the knob and peeked inside. Nobody was in the room, but there was a strange feeling that someone had just left. Max thought he'd take a quick peek around before Grandma Caliburn decided to come back. The desk lamp had been left on, washing the room in a soft emerald glow, allowing Max to see that everything was exactly as it had been. Shelves lined the walls behind the desk, with the books perfectly aligned, sorted alphabetically by author. Pictures and plaques decorated the walls in geometric precision. Even the pen and the ruler in his grandfather's desk were exactly parallel. There was no wild clutter of bills, no haphazard pile of magazines, and the newspaper bin next to his reading chair was neatly stacked. Max spied Grandpa Caliburn's familiar pipe atop the sprawling desk that occupied most of the room. The desktop was inlaid with pearl in the shape of a strange cross. It was the very same symbol that had been etched in many of the plaques along other foreign symbols that Max didn't understand. But Max had never got the chance to ask his grandfather about any of them. Just then a cold wind blew in through an open window, sending the drapes dancing in the breeze. Shivering, Max quickly walked over and shut it. Strange, he thought. He didn't think his grandmother would have left the window open. Then something even more bizarre caught his eye. Behind the desk, Max could now see that a drawer had been left ajar, if only slightly. Yet in a sea of perfection, that open drawer stuck out like a neon light, especially since he remembered every drawer in the desk had always been locked. Slowly, Max opened it, not sure what he might find, but it was empty. Maybe Grandma Caliburn was cleaning out the desk. He supposed she had to do that sooner or later. Yes, that had to be the answer, he reasoned. Yawning, Max decided it was time to return to bed. Forgetting about the cookies. As quietly as he could manage, he shut the door to the study and crept back to his room where, unfortunately, the same cold breeze was blowing through the drapes. Strangely, it felt like there was frost on the floor under his toes, and he could see his breath in the air. With a frown, he pulled down the window and huddled under his covers. For several minutes, Max lay there with only his head peeking out above the blankets. The covers were warm, but Max's feet were frozen, and even with the window shut, he could still see his breath rising from his mouth every time he breathed. Then his sleepy eyes caught sight of movement. It was only for a fraction of a second, but something had moved beneath the old bureau across the room. Max wasn't alone. He gasped in terror. Slowly, a dark silhouette crept towards his bed, keeping to the shadows as it inched across the room. It was the Slayer Goblin. There was no doubt, as the deadly monster's claws scraped the floor. It had come in through the window. Maybe it had been in his grandfather's study as well, but what did it want? Max rubbed his eyes, pinching himself to wake up, but this was no dream, and it was no game. If he didn't do something fast, the Slayer would have him. Flinging off his covers, Max sprang to the door, but the Slayer leapt after him, hungry claws lashing out. Somehow, Max was faster. As the tail of his pajama top tore from the monster's grasp, Max slammed the door, trapping the goblin on the other side. Max's heart pounded as he gripped the doorknob tightly in his sweaty hands, expecting at any moment to be swept away under a torrent of claws and teeth. Nothing happened. After a moment, he wiped a small trickle of blood from his wrist. He was wounded, but it could have been worse. Suddenly, a great howl ripped through the air as the Slayer smashed into the door, sending Max sprawling backward. Again, the monster hit the door, buckling the hinges. Cracks split the wood and the screws began to pop out. It wouldn't last much longer. Looking frantically up and down the hall, Max caught the sight of a silver cord hanging from the ceiling. And where was Logan when Max needed him the most? Unfortunately, wondering wasn't going to change anything, so like an arrow shot from a bow, Max lunged with his outstretched hand and pulled with all his might, releasing a set of old wooden stairs that slid out of the inky darkness above. Max had never seen the stairs before, but there was no time to ask questions. Up he ran, slamming shut the attic trapdoor once he had reached the top. Adjusting to the pale attic light, Max bent down and slid a bolt across the trapdoor, locking it shut. He held his breath, waiting for the monster to try to break through and hoping the small bolt would hold. Max felt he had to get a word to Logan, but how? There's no phone in the attic, and no other escape save a storm window, and that was a 30-foot drop to the ground below. It looked as if there was little Max could do but wait for morning and hope someone would come to his rescue. But after about 15 minutes, Max mostly spent holding his breath. No attack came. Max started to relax, but he had to make sure the coast was clear. Curious, though it might not have been the best idea, he unbolted the door to steal a quick peek. The hallway was empty, and he could just spy the bedroom door, which was still closed, and Max sighed in relief. But wait. It wasn't hanging off its hinges, and there were no splinters of wood littering the hallway. In fact, it looked as if nothing had happened. Nothing at all. Did he imagine the attack? Feeling rather strange and a bit unsure of himself, Max pulled the trapdoor back into place quietly and stood there in a half-light of the attic. The good news was that he and his grandma were safe. Bad news was that Max was starting to believe he was going crazy. The attic was sparsely furnished with an old floral print sofa, a few boxes of assorted magazines, and a steamer trunk overflowing with dress-up clothes. There were tattered floor lamps with their shades askew and lots of milk crates jam-packed with hundreds of envelopes and letters, but the dust was so thick that every step Max took left a soft print. From the looks of it, no one had been up here for ages. Then something caught his eye. Books, hundreds of them, lined the shelves along the far wall. All of them were bound in leather, looking old and mysterious, much like the books in Grandpa Caliburn's study. Then he saw a golden picture frame, almost as tall as he was, leaning next to the bookshelves. As Max approached, he could see an armored knight, tall and proud with piercing eyes. The sky behind him was dark and cold, and upon his chest was painted a large red cross. In one hand, the knight held a card face up, but it was too dark for Max to tell what it was. In the other hand, he held a shining blue ball of fire that seemed to flicker in the moonlight, illuminating the attic. All about the knight were stars, and on his armor were many strange symbols, oddly of the sort Max had seen in his grandpa's study. As he leaned over to get a closer look, a soft glow coming from the far corner of the attic caught Max's attention. Taking one last glance at the painting, he slowly approached the source of the strange radiance and found a desk tucked away in the corner. As Max drew closer, the glow seemed to grow brighter, and it wasn't coming from the lamp or flashlight. Somehow the light was coming from an extraordinary book bound in rich leather. It sat upon the desk with an awe-inspiring majesty, its cover traced with intricate drawings and symbols bound together by a golden lock. In the center of the cover, framed on either side by silver fittings, lay a curious slot, as if something of great import had once rested there, but was now missing. Slowly, Carefully, unable to resist, Max reached out and touched the cover. The book flashed, and a golden trail of liquid snaked around the title like a flowing river of molten metal. It read, Codex Spiritus, the Shadowlands of Fairy. Mesmerized, Max slid his fingers over the strange letters. The book was warm. And though he could never say why, Max felt as though it was somehow looking right back at him. Tingling with excitement, Max scooped up the treasure and carried it over to a nearby couch. How am I supposed to open you? Max mused, noticing there's no keyhole in the lock that held it shut. He looked for a trick release, latch, a button of some sort. And though he pushed, pulled, and pried, and pressured, the book remained safely locked. Then Max grabbed a screwdriver he had found and tried to tear it open. It didn't even leave a scratch. Abracadabra, Max called. It was the only magic word he knew. Unfortunately, that didn't work either. In frustration, Max schemed until he thought his head might explode. Then, in the quiet of his mind, he heard a whisper. A word. He didn't understand what it meant or how it got there, but it seemed to be coming from the book. Kianasara. He recited the word from his mind. Immediately, something inside the lock sprang open, and the book unfurled before his eager eyes. Fully expecting to see magic spells, runes, or even recipes for potions, Max found instead an odd pair of eyes looking directly back at him. They belonged to the painting of a rumpled creature crouched on top a giant mushroom. At first, Max thought it resembled a cat, drenched and angry after an unwanted bath. It was the color of fireplace soot, which was perhaps why it appeared so scruffy. But as Max peered closer, he realized it was no cat at all. Not even close. Where a soft pink nose should have been, there was a short, jagged beak, and the fur atop the creature's head, if fur it was, shot out like a tangled mane of spikes. There was both intelligence and mischief captured in the giant eyes that shimmered like moons in the starless sky. Its hands and feet were long and oddly stretched, ending in grasping claws, and it had a scaled tail that coiled off the edge of the mushroom cap. In fact, Max could have sworn he saw it swish back and forth. His eyes drifted slowly from the picture to the beautiful looping script and the margins written in a language he couldn't read, though it somehow looked familiar all the same. The text started to sparkle, then flash as it shot into the air with a swirl of golden light. The characters transformed into words and finally sentences that Max could actually read, though whether it was English or Max could suddenly understand a foreign language he didn't know for sure. But at the moment, amazingly, the entire page was floating in the air right before his eyes. The first line read, Spriggan, which was the name of the creature in the painting. Max was about to read the rest of the description, but his eyes were immediately drawn to the embossed seal at the bottom of the page. It was leafed in gold, surrounded by strange symbols. The seal itself, had been crafted with intricate designs resembling a series of clockworks and gears overlaid one upon the other. Faintly, he heard the soft voice whispering words into his ear once more. Spriga, kai anter intexium, Max called, this time with more assurance. There was a brief flash of light followed by a deep rumbling sound, as though the heavy wheels of steam train were slowly beginning to churn. Max watched in wonder as the seal turned and twisted by a series of gears and wheels. At first they remained on the page, spinning slowly back and forth like a combination lock trying to open. But then, with an audible click, the gears shot out like a telescope, spinning in a spectacular display of light and sound. Mist rose from the book, and the attic grew suddenly chill. Faster and faster, the vapor swirled until, like a hurricane, it roared through the room. Max desperately grabbed hold of the couch, barely able to save himself from being blown out the window. As the gale force winds grew, Max's fingers weakened. Yet despite the danger, he was transfixed. In the eye of the storm, there appeared to be a chasm, dark and deep, and out of the void shot a strange shadow hurtling toward him. A loud crack of thunder shook the walls like a mighty wave, and everything went black. Next is Chapter 3, Secrets Are Meant to Be Shared. And that will be all for now. Thank you very much for stopping by. This is Nortdeo's Reading, and tune in next time for more chapters of The Revenge of the Shadow King, Grey Griffin's Book 1.